The Ukrainian case is far from standard state relations. In the Ukrainian case, Russia is dealing with a non-state entity on its borders. Consequently, interactions with such a territory, including negotiations, fall outside the norms and customs that govern relations between sovereign states. Throughout history, international politics including warfare has been characterized by interactions among states. Each state is capable of taking significant actions to defend its fundamental interests and values. What states cannot do is engage in actions that could lead to their complete disappearance or act as mere instruments of another power dictating their strategy and tactics. Even countries like South Korea, Japan, or Germany, which have been under American influence for over 70 years, pursue independent foreign policies. They strive for this, as evidenced by their numerous attempts to maintain relations with Russia or China. If Germany were merely a tool in the hands of the US, Washington would not have needed to blow up the Nord Stream pipeline in the fall of 2022. When we observe two particular features: total willingness to self-sacrifice and execution of foreign commands regarding war and peace, what we are dealing with is not a state. It could be anything from a terrorist organization to a revolutionary movement or a private military company. In any case, the general rules are inapplicable, and interaction with such a territory falls outside the norms and customs regulating relations between sovereign states. It cannot be ruled out that Russia is dealing with such a phenomenon in Ukraine. It cannot be ruled out that Russia is dealing with such a phenomenon in Ukraine, and that the bloody crisis there arose from the failure to build a state following the collapse of the USSR in 1991. Everything else, including Kyiv's tactical decisions, in this case becomes a derivative of the failed attempt to create a sovereign state. This is quite lamentable. First, because it leads to the death of Russian soldiers and ordinary citizens. Second, because we seriously hoped that the removal of the burden of the USSR would allow Russia to finally focus on its own development rather than solely on defense. Although protecting against external enemies was originally the primary function of Russian statehood, it remains to be seen whether the Ukrainian tragedy will be unique among the numerous nations that were given their chance in 1991. The phenomenon of armed conflict with a non-state actor in international life entails several particularities. These distinguish it from the standards, even at the level of thinking, that are characteristic of conventional global politics. It seems important to remind ourselves of these in conditions where Russia once again faces an atypical situation for traditional foreign policy. Due to geographic proximity, this is not distant Afghanistan. We will have to address this problem with all the persistence, stubbornness, and patience inherent in Russian foreign policy culture. Firstly, states and their organs can engage in negotiations with non-state adversaries. However, the objective of such negotiations differs from conventional diplomacy. In traditional interstate relations, the goal of political settlement is to achieve a relatively durable peace, where the parties recognize each other's existence and status. When dealing with a terrorist organization, for example, such mutual recognition is impossible simply because they are fundamentally different entities. Living cannot make a deal with the dead, and stone with wood. Therefore, the goal of any negotiations with terrorists is to address a short-term issue, usually concerning a threat that cannot be eliminated at the moment. However, in matters beyond the state's tactical concerns, as is well known, agreements with non-state players are not made and there is an inevitable drive toward their elimination. In other words, negotiations for the release of hostages or the control of an airport building, for example, do not constitute a basis for recognizing the legitimacy of those holding them. Secondly, the fact that an adversary is not a state does not necessarily imply its weakness. On the contrary, history provides many examples of how insurgent movements or terrorist networks have been well armed and posed significant threats for decades. In this case, the primary factor is control over territory and population. When these are substantial, a non-state adversary can possess significant resources, compel the population to fight on its side, including through force. This is especially true if the adversary receives external support, as was the case with extremist movements in the North Caucasus, Syria, or Northern Ireland, where Irish militants long received funds and weapons from the United States to combat British presence. History also includes examples where certain territories remained beyond state control for extended periods, and their temporary rulers were able to secure a mobilization base. In Cambodia, even after the Vietnamese overthrow of the Khmer Rouge regime, parts of the country remained under the control of this radical movement. Local peasants would place mines on the paths of government troops under the threat of firearms or influenced by propaganda. Thirdly, states that exert external control over non-state actors never tie their own security to the survival of these actors. This means that they cannot fully anticipate the adversary's possible reactions to the actions of their agents. Since members of a terrorist organization are not official representatives or citizens of their sponsor, the sponsor's government does not bear formal responsibility for their actions. Some observers have noted that certain radical movements in Syria receive support from abroad. China, at one time, actively supported radical Marxist movements in Southeast Asian countries, providing them with various forms of assistance. However, this did not lead to a state of war with the countries where such groups operated. The USSR also supported various insurgent movements opposing the United States and its allies but did not consider this a cause for war. From the perspective of any conventional state, the only justification for war with another state is direct aggression against its national territory. This may be why the United States currently does not view its actions in the Ukrainian case as a cause for direct conflict with Russia, which the Americans fear. Finally, armed conflict with a non-state actor does not necessarily imply that the population in the territory they control is hostile. A significant portion of the population may indeed sympathize with their captors and even have personal plans tied to them. However, the majority is typically either suffering civilians or politically passive individuals who simply await the resolution of their fate without active involvement. Therefore, for traditional states, it is always a moral dilemma regarding the scale of force applied in situations that could lead to civilian casualties. These civilians are predominantly their own citizens temporarily held hostage by terrorists. What follows depends on national culture. Americans or Europeans, due to inherent racism, may resort to mass destruction of civilian populations if deemed necessary. In Russia, the practices are different, especially considering the proximity of the conflict. Non-state actors, in turn, are not bound by such constraints. They are not citizens and are driven by external directives, personal gain, or ideological motives. Therefore, acts of terrorism from their side are entirely normal. If the science of international relations is correct and Russia is indeed dealing with a non-state actor in the Ukrainian case, understanding these peculiarities can help in managing the emotional perception of how events are unfolding.